Well, good morning. Welcome. Good morning. This is very, very exciting. I'm so happy to be here in this beautiful city. This is my first time visiting, and I'm already loving it, even though I've just arrived yesterday afternoon. And what a wonderful opportunity to be here at this conference and talking to you all. I hope you found your way into the right room. I hope you weren't looking for the ice cream stall, which is round the corner. You don't need to know that. You'll need to know that later on. But for the moment, let's get started. I'll give another very brief introduction. Hello, my name, as you just heard, is Phil. I'm Phil Hawksworth, and I do indeed work at Netlify, working on developer experience there. You did hear that there'll be some time for questions at the end, hopefully. Fingers crossed, if I get the timings right, we'll have time for that. I'm very happy as well just to talk just around the conference. I'm here both days, so if you've got questions or comments and you either don't get a chance to ask them later on, or you're not so comfortable asking them later on, grab me around the conference, or later on, or if you're watching this on the video, hello. If you're watching this later and you want to ask questions, you can find me on social media. My name is my name, because that keeps it easy for me. You have to do a bit more work, but I'm at Phil Hawksworth on, I don't know. I used to say Twitter. I don't know what to call it. I don't even know what social media is anymore. But I'm in most places you'll find me as Phil Hawksworth, and I'm very, very happy to talk and happy to answer questions wherever I possibly can. I must probably apologize, first of all, because I've already, in the title of this talk, started introducing terminology, and there are a couple of bits of terminology we're going to cover along the way, so sorry about that, but we're in it together, so we'll be fine. But a couple of bits of terminology that I just want to address right up front, and we'll be talking about these as we get into the talk, are rendering and personalisation. So those are, and the personalisation spectrum, rather, those are a couple of things that you'll be hearing about throughout the day, and I should probably expand on those and maybe define those a little bit before we get into this, because some people will have different expectations about what these things might mean. So let's start off with talking about what I actually mean when I say rendering. Because this definition, or the use of this word, I think has changed over the years. As you heard in the introduction, I've been building for the web for about 25 years, which is terrifying to me now that I say that out loud. But back when I started talking about this, I think about rendering as producing HTML that the browser can then turn into a view for us, or manipulating the DOM in the browser, so doing things client-side and doing DOM manipulation. And that's kind of what we kind of understand as rendering, I guess, these days. But when I first used this term, rendering, it was back at the party before a conference in 2013, where I was talking to someone and I was waving my hands around, explaining what I was going to talk about in my talk. And I used this expression, something, rendering on a server. And the person I was talking to responded with this. He laughed in my face. He just said, "Do you mean serving HTML?" And I guess I did, really, because it used to be that when we talked about web development, it was a simpler time. We used to have servers that were blissfully dumb, and we had clients that were dumb as well. And it was a simple time, and that was lovely, because a web browser would make a request of the web server and say, "Have you got this thing?" And the web server would say, "Yes, I do. Here you are, and you can render that for us." And so the idea of rendering on the server didn't really seem like it made a lot of sense. So they would just return HTML. And of course, as experiences in browsers that we're designing and developing got a bit more sophisticated, we started to have compute happening on the server. So manipulation would happen on the server. We would generate that response based on various variables and data. And so compute and actions happen on the server. So we were rendering, I guess, on the server, but we were generating the response. And then, of course, things got more sophisticated still, and we got JavaScript and different runtimes happening in the client, in our web browser. So a few different places started to evolve that we could do the work to generate our views. Now, this is a good time, I think, to mention that I care really deeply about the web and about the principles that make it possible and make it robust, one of them being the robustness principle. And this is, there's a design principle of the web, of the rule of least power, and I subscribe to this very strongly. I think it's really important. And in essence, it talks about choosing the simplest tool or the simplest language, the simplest approach that is possible to do the thing that you need to do. And that's one of the kind of guiding design principles of the web. And I like to apply that wherever I possibly can. So when I see this currently feels kind of blissfully simple, but there are a couple of places where variables and actions can happen there. So I got quite excited about the opportunity of moving some of this complexity out of the way of the time that we need to create a view. I like the idea of the server being dumb and moving that closer to a build time, so something that can happen before the user even comes to the website. So I like the idea of generating a view or rendering a view at build time, so then the server can be dumb and just serve the things. It's kind of nice. Over time, we've started to add more places where we could do the work of producing the view. So now there's build servers, there's our web servers, there's the edge, whatever that is. But in this context, we're talking about a content delivery network that serves our website and being able to do things very close to the edge of that network and having serverless functions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But either way you look at it, there are lots of places where we can do the work of rendering or generating the view for the things that we're going to display in our browser. Now, luckily, there are lots of tools to help us with this, and this is just one. Are there any people familiar with Nuxt, the Nuxt framework built on Vue? A few hands, okay. So this is one of just many different frameworks that offers some help here. I was looking at the site, and this describes, it says, one of their features is on-demand rendering. You can have rendering using SSR, SSG, CSR, ISR, ESR, SWR. Whew. There's a lot going on, and I think, by thunder, there are a lot of ways to approach rendering, which is why I want to talk about it today. So we will unpack some of these approaches to rendering. But in particular, I want to talk about how this pertains to personalization. So we'll come back to rendering in a few minutes. Let's talk about this other term that I introduced at the beginning as well. Because I use this expression that I may or may not have made up, I'm not sure, but it's come from lots of conversations I've had with clients over the years about personalization and building personalization, because I truly believe that it really is a spectrum. We don't really need to think of personalization as a binary thing of it being on or off, existing or not. It really does exist on a spectrum. And this is the kind of request I'd often have from clients at the beginning of a project. They'd say, we need the site to be personalized for the users, particularly large brands and large enterprises would state this as a requirement. And I'm not sure this is a requirement. I think this is something that actually is too broad to be able to describe as a requirement. I think this is an ambition. And I think we need to drill into the details of what that means. Because the first question I would ask when I was told this is I would say, what will the personalized content be, and does it currently exist? And often, when I ask that question, I will get a blank face, and people will go, yeah, we don't know, but we definitely want it personalized, but we don't know what that looks like yet. So this is a really important thing to tease out really early, I think, because challenges in personalization exist in a number of areas. I think they exist in technology, in terms of data, and also in terms of content. And I think these three key things are really important when we're thinking about personalizing our experiences. So in terms of technology, what I mean there is, does the platform or our technology stack provide personalization? Does it support it at all? When it comes to the data, do we know who the user is? Do we know anything about them and what to show them? And then in terms of content, do we have all of the content and the ways to manage it in order to bring these things together? And typically on projects, when we start, the first question comes to here. It's like, okay, does the stack support it? Are we building on a product that supports the idea of personalization? Even if we haven't given any consideration to the two on the right, because if you haven't got an answer for both of those on the right, it really doesn't matter what the stack is, because you're not going to do personalization unless you've got the content and the insights to be able to do it. So this is a really important kind of switch in the way we approach it, I think. Luckily, though, it's not all or nothing. So it can be a bit overwhelming, but as I said, personalization lives on a spectrum. So let's unpack that a little bit and talk a little bit about what we mean. So let's describe this spectrum a little bit. And since it's a spectrum, there could be lots of things that live on here, but I'm going to call out just a few points along the way. And as you might imagine, it starts off on the left with not personalized at all, and on the right, it's very highly personalized. And as we move from left to right, it gets closer to being very, very, very targeted and very personalized. The other thing we should say is, as we move from left to right, the implications of what we're building and the complexity grows as we move from left to right in terms of technology, in terms of data, in terms of content. So let's just look at this a little bit more. So not personalized at all. We've all seen this, a global site where all of the content is universal and is intended for everyone. As you'd expect, this is the simplest to build, simplest to populate with content, and where we typically start. And then as we move a little bit to the right, we introduced other aspects of personalization. And the next stage that I like to identify is content that's localized. And I don't mean internationalized in terms of being translated. I'm talking about content which is different. Different content is served to different visitors from specific locations or regions around the world. And we'll look at some examples of that later on. But that feels like the next step in terms of personalization. Then we move further down this kind of complexity path to more heavily personalized content. The next step I'd like to call out is segmented. So segmented sites are where we kind of batch the content and serve different versions of content to different cohorts of users. So those might be people who are accessing at a different time or have visited the site before, or some other way that we can put those users into buckets and then serve content that we've curated for them. And then finally, down this path to personalization, we've got fully personalized. So content intended for a specific individual based on what we know about them. So you can imagine as you move from left to right that the complexity and the implications of building these things grow as we travel down there. And the further we go down that path, the more content we have to create and the more insights we have to have about the people accessing that. So I kind of want to remind you of this slide. I mentioned the rule of least power, and I care about this also when crafting the experience for the user and trying to think about how we'll develop things. I think it's really important to start as simple as possible and then layer on the complexity as we know we can justify it and as we need it. What's the least amount of personalization we can have to satisfy the needs of the project? And what is the constraining factor? Is it that the platform doesn't do what we need? Is it that we don't have the insights? Is it that we're not going to create lots of different variants of content? We need to be aware of that. So that's kind of laying out the basics of what rendering is and what this term, the personalization spectrum, kind of means. So let's return now to talking about rendering a little bit. So often when we talk about rendering, we think about where it happens. Does it happen server side? Does it happen client side? It's all about the where. So what is the place that it happens? I think it's really important to also consider the time that it happens. When does that happen? And so let's talk a little bit about the what, where, when, how, and why. Actually, how doesn't really fit because it's not a W, so we'll drop that, which helps me for time, so that's good. We're going to talk a little bit about these other aspects, though. And I'm sorry to say this means introducing more terminology. And this feels like another theme throughout this talk, the recognition that naming is hard. Naming things, really difficult. I suck at it. Everyone sucks at it. It's difficult. These are some terms to do with rendering. We're not going to go through all of them, don't worry. We'll have a little sample. We'll dip into a few of them. Some of them, people in the room will know very well already. Some of them, I think, have been misunderstood a tiny bit. So I want to talk about a few of them. And one of them I've mentioned already at the very beginning, static site generation, pre-generation of sites. And this happens, you'll be familiar with these lines and boxes that we had earlier on. This happens at the build stage, on a build server, and it happens before the user ever even knows they're going to request a site. So this is doing work up in advance of when the users come along. And it used to be that when I was talking about this kind of thing, I'd have to do this comparison. It feels like I have to do this less and less these days, but it's worth just calling out, the traditional stack that we might have been used to over the years, where clients in browsers make a request for a view of something, and that hits our infrastructure. And that infrastructure might be a number of different web servers or applications that we need to spread the traffic out across those. So we'll have some load balancers that manage that. And then they pass those requests on to web servers that try and figure out what they need to generate and return. And they might need to talk to databases in different servers to get what they need to then return that. So this request goes all the way up and all the way back, and we have to manage it all. One of the things that I got very excited about over the last 8 or 9 years is this idea of a return to this simplicity. You've heard already me talk about simplicity today. This idea that we can pre-generate things with things like static site generation so that they're all ready to go on a set of servers that are optimized just for serving static things, this content delivery network. And this only really became compelling when we started to automate things like the build and then trigger the builds off different changes, doing this part of the work ahead of time so that we could serve things simply. That got very, very compelling with lots of different providers that exist these days. And so this is really the model that supports static site generation, or SSG. Okay, let's keep moving on. So CSR, client-side rendering, this is a term, again, many people will be familiar with. This is doing things in the browser, right? This is doing things with JavaScript. So it's happening at the other end of the chain. This, as I said, happens in the browser, but when does it happen? Well, it happens when all of the assets have been downloaded. So when you've served all of the JavaScript assets to the browser, those have been requested and returned. And sometimes this happens when the user interacts. So it's a way that we often find that we're making things that we think are very dynamic. But often we use CSR these days to render everything. Everything gets rendered in the client because we love building things in JavaScript to JavaScript developers. We love that. So we do everything in the browser. My friend Harry Roberts is a performance consultant, and he talks about CSR being the fastest way to build the slowest websites, which is maybe not entirely fair. It's not always the case, but it's certainly a risk, and certainly some of us, me, have done that in the past. So let's keep moving on. So this is the term, I promise we'll be done with terminology soon. This is the one that I think feels like it's the most understood, but I reckon it's the one that gets misunderstood the most often. Because this is, so SSR, server-side rendering, this is, as you might imagine, rendering that's happening on the server. What I was thinking about all those years ago when I said that the server returned HTML. But what do we mean by the server, and when does it happen? So it happens at request time. So in other words, in response to the user coming along and asking for something in their browser. Where does it happen? Happens in the server. But a lot of people talk about it happening everywhere other than the client. And I can understand why people make that mistake. Because again, if we look at this diagram, we've just talked about client-side rendering. So surely, if that's client-side rendering, then the other side, well, that's not client-side rendering, that's server-side, right? Is that the server-side? Well, I guess that's the not client-side, but that doesn't have a nice ring to it. But this is often where people think about server-side rendering. But realistically, when we're talking about server-side rendering, we're not talking about all of this. We're talking about things happening on the server, but particularly at request time. So yeah, I wanted to kind of call out that slight difference. You might argue, well, maybe there's another place that's not on the client that we could be doing things at request time, and that's at the edge. And that's true. But luckily, we have a term for that as well, and that's edge-side rendering. And this is something that's been around for a really, really long time, but has only become really available to many of us as web developers more recently with the kind of frameworks and tools that are much more available to us now. And so edge-side rendering happens there at the edge. So in other words, close to the user on the content delivery network, and it's typically provided by serverless runtimes. So these now happen kind of around the CDN, and we're talking about serverless functions but that are optimized for very fast responses at the edge of the CDN. Okay, a lot of terminology, a lot of talking, and I've waved my hands like this a lot through that. So you might be asking, fairly, which one is best? The answer that I have for you, and the answer that we all hate, is it depends. And so, great, you're thinking that's 18 minutes of my life and you haven't given us an answer. But hopefully, some of you might also then be thinking, okay, it depends on what? Because that's a really important question. It depends, I think, is a very valid answer as long as it elicits this following question. So I'm glad you asked. And what I'd say is that keep in mind the rule of least power. Again, the best option is the simplest option that satisfies your requirements, and then we can layer things on over time. I often think about which is the best tool for digging a hole. I reckon this thing, whatever that is, pretty good at it, but I'm not going to dig my garden with it. So I really think about simplicity up front. I was having this conversation a little while ago about different rendering types. I'm fun at parties. It wasn't at a party. It was where we all go for sensible, reasoned discourse. It was on Twitter. And the conversation kind of got a bit prickly, and people saying, no, you have to do things server-side these days. It has to be SSR. And I'm not someone who cares about absolutes. I like being a bit more pragmatic. So my response to this is that server-side doesn't have to mean server-full. In other words, we don't have to have a physical or a virtual server. We can be doing things not client-side, but we could be doing things in things like serverless environments. So server-side doesn't have to be server-full. If I can do things in advance, I will. I'll always use static generation if I can. But if I can't do that, if the requirements don't allow it, but I can do things in a serverless function, I'll do that. But if I can't do that for some reason, but I can add a server, I'll do that. So I'm always thinking about layering things on. I'm thinking about increments whenever I'm designing an implementation. And speaking of increments, I lied when I said we were done with terminology, because there's all of this stuff. All of this is acronyms that relate to incremental rendering. Actually, that's not quite true. I've got some good news. One of these isn't real. The last one is just how I feel about it when I see this list, so we'll get rid of that. And I've got more good news for you. 3 of these things actually mean the same thing, and the 4th one usually means the same thing. So let's just describe this for a second. And I'm sorry that there are so many terms for this, but many different organizations have tried to get together and name very much the same thing. You may or may not be aware that earlier in the year, Netlify acquired Gatsby, and as we came together, even in our company Slack, there were discussions about naming. We're saying, what are we going to name this new organization? Is it going to be called Gatlify, Netsby, Getslify? These are real suggestions in our company Slack, by the way. Natsflibby, anyone? Anyone? No surprise at all that the runaway most popular suggestion in our Slack was Natsflibby, because naming is hard, and also it seems is logo design. This is one of the logos that was offered in the Slack, in our Slack community. We haven't rolled that out. I don't know if we ever will. But the idea that we might be able to get together and reduce these down to one name, probably unlikely. But let me describe what these things are anyhow. So there are 3 terms I put on the screen. I put DPR, ODB, and DSG. These all mean the same thing, thankfully. So DPR, or distributed persistent rendering, is an approach to rendering that Netlify wanted to bring as a primitive to our infrastructure and hopefully to other infrastructures. So we wrote an RFC, sorry, another acronym. We wrote a request for comments outlining this approach. And the idea being that instead of generating all of the assets of a build up front, some of those would be left until later, like kind of distributed across into another time so that they're rendered and persisted later on. And we built an implementation of that we called on-demand builders. Already, as far as I'm concerned, one term too many, but there we are. So the idea being that on-demand builders would be a type of serverless function that when you called them on demand, they would build out a view and then persist that. Now, at the same time, the people at Gatsby, when they were separate to us, they built an implementation of exactly the same thing, but they called it, I think, something better. They called it DSG, or deferred static generation, meaning that they would be generating a static asset that would be the view of a site, but they would defer that until it was first asked for. So really, you kind of summarize all of these things as don't generate it in the build, wait until the first time it's requested, then generate it and add to what was built earlier. The acronym for that, of course, you'll be aware is that, which is hard to pronounce, but naming is hard, so we stuck with one of the others. So this has all been possible because of this idea of serverless runtimes being way more available to us now, and the fact that we can support these workflows that are the same as effectively building static sites. It makes it very seamless to build these experiences and get those distributed. But there's this other term as well, ISR. I haven't talked about that. So this is incremental static regeneration. And this is made popular by the Next framework. It was originally implemented as an implementation of the stale while revalidate caching pattern. And you can actually use it in a number of ways, but the way that it's typically used, but again, you can adapt this. It's probably easiest to show that in relation to the other version that we've got. So on-demand builders, as I just mentioned, mentioned, a build happens, but some of the views are left out until the user comes along and then they say, I'd like to see that view, please. So we generate that view, we populate it, and we return it to them. And then every subsequent user who wants that thing exists, so they just get it. ISR is a little bit different in its default state in that when we do our build to start off with, we build kind of a scaffold of what might be there, an initial state of that view, so that when the user comes to get it, it's there and ready for them right away. But it might not be entirely up to date. But the fact that the user has come to ask for it triggers a refresh of that, so that will go and regenerate dynamically. Using client-side JavaScript, typically we'll get an update to that view and render that in the client. But then also that view has been refreshed on the server so that when the next user comes along, they get something which is not entirely fresh, but reasonably fresh. And then that action again updates that view. They get that client side, and so it goes on. So, fair question from you all. Which is better, ISR or DPR? And I think you can probably guess the answer. It depends. Because deciding demands that we ask some questions. And the key one, and what kind of will bring us back to personalization, is what are the requirements? And so, I wanted to start looking at how we can combine a lot of these different rendering frameworks or rendering approaches to build things out. So I did what many of us might do. I built an experiment. So I built an experiment where I would add to my site an ability to stash all of my posts that I've ever put onto social media for reasons. I decided that I wanted to have that myself. So I set myself a few different requirements for this. So one of them was that I wanted a URL that was distinct for every one of the 24,000 things that I've said on Twitter over the years. I wanted a distinct URL for each one of those. I wanted an index page that kind of listed all of those so that would be easily crawlable by search engines, and I'd have an entry point in to discover the URL for all of these things. I wanted the ability to search across all of that content on my site. And I wanted to retain a reasonable build time. Now, this is a key one because one of the challenges we often find with generating sites like this is that when you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of URLs, building can get to be a long process. So I wanted to keep the build time reasonable for my personal site. I wanted to avoid client-side rendering because that's a bottleneck in of itself, and I wanted to deliver the content as HTML so that it's fault-tolerant and I'm observing the rule of least power. And I wanted a logical model that fit in my mind because this sounds like it could get complicated. So I wanted to be able to reason about this, and I wanted 6 months in the future Phil to not hate past Phil, as he so very often does. So I wanted a logical model that would fit in my head. So I found an approach that I could use static site generation, distributed persistent rendering, terminology, and edge-side rendering together to make this work. And this is all possible because of the fact that the content is abstracted and it's in a big piece of JSON data. So this is what it looks like, some lines and boxes, and then I'll actually show you what it looks like. So we have our build, a site generator that takes JSON and templates, munges those together, and then outputs some assets, some views. It renders those views at build time. And what we're getting is those index pages listing all of my posts, but also the content pages for the rest of my site. And that's ready so that when a user comes along, they make a request for that, and they get it. And this is what that looks like. It's nothing particularly groundbreaking. I think you've seen personal websites before. I think you've seen paginated lists of pages before. But these are all generated at build time in the way that I'm just describing. And I can page through them, page to the end. Ooh, 955 pages of pure gold of my Twitter stream with all of my tweets out there. Okay. So let's move along. We have a URL for each page of those, and we can move through them. I mentioned build time. What are we looking at the moment? Well, the build stays close to 2 seconds in the environment that I host it. Locally, my build stays at about 1 second, which I think is just fine for when I'm building things out. And it deploys end-to-end on Netlify, which is where I personally host my site, in about 30 seconds. But the build is under 2 seconds, so that's good. We've got a tick in that box as well. But we haven't got 24,000 URLs added to here yet. We've just added 1,000. So what happens for all of the individual URLs for each of the pages? Well, here, this is the perfect place to do distributed persistent rendering. So I use an on-demand builder for that. So when the user goes to ask for a view of any particular tweet or post. If it doesn't exist already, they'll come here. They'll hit this serverless function, which will go off to the exact same logic that I used to build the site, the same blob of JSON, the same templates. It will generate that view. It'll add it to the things that had already been built, and then it will return that to the user as a post page. And that, unsurprisingly, looks like this. You know, if I click on the permalink for any of these things, we can see the precious tweet, and these are precious. What does that say? Started my day making the perfect piece of buttered toast. This made me happy. Okay, so not all of the tweets are necessarily groundbreaking, but I wanted them nonetheless. So each one has a URL. This kind of proves the point nicely. And so we've got, gradually over time, we'll end up with 24,000 tweets of pure goodness that everyone can access. Search came next. How do we do that? Well, this is where I decided to use edge-side rendering. So this, again, is a serverless function that is what the search form on my site will post to. So if someone comes along and they search for something on my site, it will hit this edge-side function, which will do very close to what has been happening before. It will go and look at the data that exists, find, just using some very simple string matching, what exists in there, render that template out, and return that as a search results page, which gets sent back to the user. And this is what happens as an example of doing that. You know, so here we are. I search for render to see if I've been talking about rendering before. And I've said 169 things about rendering on Twitter over the years, apparently. So that I can look through there and I can visit the permalink. All of these things are working together. What was I saying? My wife keeps sending me random pictures of our cat rendered as a cuddly toy, and I'm here for it. Okay, so not all of the results about rendering are exactly relevant to this talk, but they're keyed on the word render in this example, and we've got a URL that is persistent for the rendering. If you're wondering what I'm talking about there, this is what I'm talking about. This is what happens when I go on trips. I get sent pictures like this, or this. I don't know what the hell is going on with this. This is terrifying. If you're not a cat person, dog person, don't worry. She does it for next door's dog as well. These are the things I get sent to me as rendered. Okay, I digress. The reason all of this is possible is because of the abstraction and the decoupling of the content from the views. Here I'm talking about using a big piece of JSON, which is available at build time and at request time. But this could be any piece of data. And this abstraction is really key to unlocking different types of rendering and also then personalization. And there are lots of frameworks and tools that kind of give you these, I talk about rendering sugar, these abilities to kind of access different rendering techniques through their framework. But also the different platforms such as Netlify and others are building out these primitives so you can access them directly, which is what I was doing there. So, okay, half an hour in, should we apply this to personalization? Because I laid out this whole personalization spectrum earlier on. Let's think about how some of these techniques apply there as well. So let's start with the most basic one, global content. Well, pages generated at build time using static site generation, that works just fine for that. That one's kind of covered. It's not really personalized. That's our baseline, if you like. How about localized content? Well, this works perfectly nicely in the same way, where we can generate all of the content for different localizations, or indeed internationalizations if we wished, at build time. And then we can use some logic to direct users to the appropriate URLs that deliver that content for them. We don't actually need anything dynamic to do that. We can pre-generate all of that and then do some simple routing to send people to the right places. And so this is, again, just using static site generation. This ability to configure traffic and send people visiting your sites from different locations to different URLs is kind of a baseline feature on a lot of hosting providers now and can be done very, very simply. A good example of doing this actually was from a few years ago, but I like this example because often we think about localization, we tend to think about just translating and actually internationalization. This is a different example. This is not built on the framework that I've been describing, but it's a perfect contender for it. So this is Nike's site, and shortly after the Euros in 2016, after Portugal won, they kind of highlighted the Portuguese team on lots of their football sites all around the world, except France, because Portugal beat France in the final. So in France, they instead just heroed some of the athletes instead and didn't talk about it in the same ways. It still happened. That loss still happened, I should be clear. But this is a great example of sending different users in a different location to a very specific experience on the site. So this is a perfect contender for the approach that I just described. Okay, let's move up the chain of complexity, talk about some segmented traffic instead. Well, we can add this as a layer, so we can still be building out all our global content ahead of time. We can still be localizing in the same way, but then we could be starting to address different cohorts of users through the use of cookies and the use of edge functions or serverless rendering to enrich those views for particular users. So this is using static site generation and edge-side rendering. Good examples of this might be a different experience on your site of people who were there for the first time versus people who are returning. It doesn't necessarily need to be a web application to have the need for onboarding. You can have that in simple e-commerce experiences or content experiences as well. Again, an example of this isn't built in this way, but I wanted just to call this out. We've seen these kind of things where you arrive on a site for the first time and it recognizes you've never been there before, so it shows you some tips about onboarding. It might be teaching you how to add things to your basket or where to discover the content around the site. This can be done by including this for everyone unless you see a cookie that has been dropped on the site from a previous experience, and then something like an edge function for edge-side rendering can just hide that for wherever a user has come along where they see that cookie that they've been there before. So it's a very logical way of adding this kind of functionality to a site without having to have loads of infrastructure to do it. Okay, and then a couple of areas around the fully personalized experience. Again, we're layering things on. So we've got global or localized pages, we've got users directed to those things. Now, again, we're using cookies and edge functions to change the views based on user preferences. Again, static site generation, edge-side rendering. I guess this is maybe more of like the cohort thing. So based on your preference for your theme, we've all seen theme switches. This is the kind of thing that, again, is kind of personalized things to a touch. But a better example is something like this, I think. I wanted to show you the real version of this, but the client that I worked with on this hasn't launched this yet. But we did a one-day hackathon with a large enterprise who'd been trying to get personalization into their sites for a really long time. And they have a bunch of different news content and news stories on their homepage. So what they added was the ability for just keeping a track of which URLs people had visited in their domain in a cookie, and mentioning what content tag that is associated with. And then with an edge function, they would recommend other stories based on the themes that people had already been exploring. And they put that together in a day. It's a really powerful example of what could be done with these tools. Okay. And finally, fully personalized, now adding client-side rendering as well to all of this mix. This is the kind of thing we see in logged-in experiences, particularly where it's personal data to you. And I'm drawing an example from very close to home for the Netlify dashboard, because this is me logged in, this is my data, this is the states of all of my build and my configurations and all of the rest of it. Now, this is delivered as a framework, as a static asset, but then it's using client-side rendering built with React to then manipulate that based on calls to authenticated APIs. Okay. Wow, time has got on. We're at 38 minutes, so let me wrap through some of the lessons. But what I wanted to call out is that there are many techniques and options across this whole personalization spectrum, and we can start simple and we can layer them on. So let's finish that thought, because there is no one right way, as is often the case with building things for the web or building things with computers. There's no one right way to do it. But it no longer requires, when we're thinking about personalization, it no longer requires a large monolithic application that has personalization written on the box. We can now start to build these things out. There are frameworks that exist to help us with different rendering techniques, and the primitives exist on the platforms now as well. As I've said so many times today, personalization exists on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing, and we can start to really think about how we introduce that slowly, based not just on the platform, but what content we have and what experiences we want to create for the user. I always like to do the work ahead of time, if I possibly can, to get the risk as far away from the user as possible. And you can mix and match these rendering methods. I'd kind of close by saying, never choose your approach until you understand the requirements. It's really tempting to use the tool that we're excited about, but I would always say, think very carefully about what the requirements are of what we're building before we decide how we're going to do it, and also understand the constraints that exist. You know, will the content exist? Will it ever exist? Does it exist now? Are ones that we often overlook when we're talking with clients about personalization. And really, you know, keep the rule of least power in mind. And if anything, from looking at those tweets on my site, we've also learned that not all of my tweets are pure gold, but maybe some of them are. So if you want more, I write about this stuff on my own blog or on the Netlify blog. As I mentioned, you can find me on social media at Phil Hawksworth. These slides are available online now if you want. QR codes are back, everyone. Who knew? They're a real thing. If you want that, you can find that at personalisation, or you can zap that QR code, and that'll get you there. And I think that leaves us about 5 minutes for questions. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Phil, for your presentation and explaining us that everything depends.
It depends. It's an answer that frustrates so many people, but I think it's a really important thing to have in a conversation.
It's time for your questions.
Right here.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was a very good overview.
Great, thanks.
What I fail to understand is the difference between all of this and the good old server-side rendering with caching for a long time, the HTML result on CDN servers, and then evicting the cache on content change. Can you explain the difference?
So the difference between what? Between
the most complicated thing, I don't remember the acronyms, but generating the content on demand, so at build time, but on demand, and just creating a regular website, maybe using a good old technology like C#, I don't know, and caching the produced HTML or rendered HTML on the server on CDN, localized, for a long time, like infinite caching, and then evicting the cache when the content changes or when a deploy happens.
Well, the result of that can be very similar, right? And there are tons of different approaches to caching, and cache management is really complicated. It's the kind of thing that I never ever want to do. And so if you do have something that can change based on every request, you have to then make your own decisions about how you want to manage that cache, when you want to invalidate that cache, and so on. Depending on your rendering model, that may be more complex or less complex. And so so the answer to this question is, it depends. But effectively, you know, I like to try and regenerate things as infrequently as possible, depending on, you know, when they're really going to change. We think about blogs as a great example, right? A blog post on something like WordPress, a blog is effectively a write infrequently, read very frequently, hopefully, model. But often we'll be going to a database and rendering that out and then saying, oh no, we now need to manage the cache, even though things haven't changed. So it really does depend on the way that you're building things, but ultimately, if you can normalize the way that you have to behave in the cache by saying, I only ever update this when I'm publishing the content, it's nothing to do when it's being read, then you'll have a simpler time. But depending on the kind of experience you're building, you're going to have to build these things out differently. So it's not a tidy answer, I'm afraid, to the question, but ultimately it's going to be different on the use case. Any other questions? Oh, there's one right at the back. Oh, you're going to have to run. You won't run.
Hi, you may have touched on this a bit. I was wondering, have you worked with any customers that have fallen into the anti-pattern of wanting things infinitely flexible and infinitely personalizable? And if so, how do you manage those expectations?
So the question was, have I worked with clients that have wanted things infinitely flexible and infinitely scalable?
Personalizable.
Personalizable. Yes, I have. And usually that's at the beginning of the conversation because they're looking down a list of features and things that and aspirations. And that's one of the reasons I often ask about what is it you're going to serve them? What are you going to serve the users? Because trying to put that challenge back into their court of saying, okay, you want to have full customization and personalization across these things. What are you planning on delivering to these people? Because often we arrive as the technical partners to this conversation, but the content aspect is really important. So that's why I always ask that up front, because very often the question is, we don't know, or we'll figure that out later. So the sooner I can bring that into the conversation, the sooner we can start to unpick that, because yeah, where there are so many products that offer, you know, written on the side of the box, you know, full customization, full personalization. Implementing that is much more difficult than just ticking the box and turning it on. So you're really right to call that out, and managing that expectation really early is very critical. I start by asking them, what is the experience you want to have, and do you have that content? And then we gradually start to roll that back. Sometimes you find that actually the implementation or the experience can be way simpler than what they had in mind to start off with, just because of actually the limitations that they themselves have. So that's where I start. But that's not always a conversation you don't win a conversation, do you? That's not a negotiation I often win, but that's the technique that I've had the most success with, by challenging exactly what their expectations are, asking them to describe exactly what they mean. That's where I start.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any more? Well, if there are no more questions, as I say, you can always ask me questions as they occur to you on. Oh, that's gone. Oh, this is fine. At Phil Hawksworth on Twitter. Or again, I'm around for the next couple of days at the conference, so please feel free to come and tap me on the shoulder. Ask me any questions. Let me know you agree, or if you disagree, that's fine too, and we'll have a chat. But thanks
so Phil, let me also read one question.
Oh, okay, we do have more.
From the slide. So in your opinion, what's the future of creating websites in terms of the tech stack? On what ideas or solution would be the biggest focus?
What's my expectation for the future of the tech stack, and what's the solution that will have the ideal? I don't know. I don't know is the honest answer. If anyone says they know what the future is in terms of tech stacks, I think they're guessing. I'm definitely seeing the pendulum swings backwards and forwards, right? You know, it used to be that we put everything in the client, and then we put everything in the server, and we're moving back and forward between the two. I'm hoping we'll find some nice balance between them. I hope we're seeing a bit of a move away from doing everything client side, because there has been a bit of a trend of that. And it feels like some of the modern frameworks are balancing a little bit more about doing things either at build time or in some kind of not in the client, whether that's, you know, in a function or what have you, and then just using client-side rendering just to do the embellishment at the end. So I'm hoping that the future will be frameworks that make that very easy and make that very logical for people. But trends are weird. We're a fickle bunch, developers. You know, we like to build things that excite us. So I don't know, but that's what I hope.